Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members. My name is Carolyn Chu from the Legislative Analyst's Office. So if you'd please go back to the handout that Mr. Cabral was using, I'll pick back up on that handout for my presentation to you here today. So starting on page 7, so we've been asked to lay out for you some of the findings and assessment we have from our recent review of local control and accountability plans. So I'm going to go through those at a high level. The chart on page 7 goes into more detail about which I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm going to focus on some of the key points. And I'll go in the order essentially of the figure that we have on page 5. So starting with the goals and priority areas, actions, metrics, and targets. And then I'll be talking about the services for English learner and low-income students. So to start, Mr. Cabral and I reviewed 50 LCAPs from districts across the state. We included the top 11 districts by enrollment in our sample and then created a stratified random sample for the remaining 39 districts based on the size of the districts and their relative concentration of English learner and low-income students. And then made adjustments on the margin to ensure that we had good geographic diversity in our sample. So our sample included 24 districts from 24 counties across the state and covers 28% of enrollment across the state as well. So our review was to looking at the relative comprehensiveness of the LCAPs that districts were putting together and trying to identify common themes. We weren't necessarily evaluating the individual choices that districts were making, but we were trying to understand how this process of LCAP development was working for districts. So in addition to reviewing these 50 LCAPs, we also went out to the field and talked to a number of districts and county offices to provide some context for what we were seeing in the LCAPs. So let me just start with our overall finding and assessment, which is that this process, LCAP development, is a positive one for districts. Districts repeated to us over and over that this process helped them align their resources with their needs. It helped them think about how they were going to take the money they were getting under LCFF and attack the key areas in their districts that they needed to work on to improve student outcomes. That said, what we found in our review of the LCAPs was that the requirements under the LCAP legislation is quite significant. Districts have to talk about goals across 8 state priority areas, include 24 different metrics, discuss 12 different subgroups, include different targets and actions for individual schools. Really, this effort can be quite substantial for a district to tackle. Instead of being a strategic plan focused on their core areas of need, it's really a comprehensive plan that describes all of the issue areas across the district. So districts approached that challenge by focusing on particular state priority areas through their LCAP more than others. So that is to say that we most frequently saw goals and actions around the student achievement priority area, which is what you would expect, and then often fewer goals and metrics in areas like parental involvement and that sort of thing. In terms of the actions that we saw across districts, districts were pursuing relatively similar actions in their LCAPs. The most frequently cited action that we saw was professional development, particularly in the area of Common Core implementation. The next most frequently cited elements were community engagement, purchasing of materials, purchasing of technology, and implementing differentiated instruction in the district for students. One of the issues that we had in understanding what was going on in districts was an inability to differentiate between activities that districts were carrying on from the prior year and new activities that districts were pursuing for the coming school year. So that's to say districts didn't differentiate between actions that were new versus those that were ongoing for the district. So it was difficult to tell how the funding increases that districts were receiving were going towards the activities that they were pursuing. If they were expanding activities or pursuing new strategies, we couldn't tell because the districts, for the most part, did not differentiate their activities in that manner. In terms of metrics and targets, the vast majority of LCAPs that we reviewed set a single target for all students in the district. So that's to say they set a single target for graduation rates, a single target for truancy. They did not break out among their subgroups or among individual school sites. In addition, districts did not include baseline data for the metrics that they provided, so they didn't say what their starting point was. As a result, it was difficult to know whether the targets that districts were setting for the next 3 years were reasonable. So if a district was saying they wanted to get to a 95% graduation rate in the next year, we had no way of knowing if that's something we could expect the district to be able to do, because we didn't know if they were starting at 75 or 93 in that year. Moving on to the English learner and low-income services, as I think Mr. Allen mentioned, one of the requirements of the LCAP is to demonstrate compliance with the English learner and low-income student supplemental services provisions, which are that districts must increase or improve services in proportion to the funds generated by those students in a particular year. Overall, what we found is that the LCAPs didn't provide sufficient information to know whether or not districts were meeting that requirement. That is, their discussion of the services that they were providing did not provide enough information to know if the services were being increased or improved. Rather, the descriptions were usually just a summary of what was being offered, not a comparison of whether, not a comparison of what was provided last year versus what will be provided this year. Moreover, if districts choose to use their supplemental and concentration funding on a school-wide or district-wide basis, the regulations require them to justify that use. The justifications that we saw in districts' LCAPs did not explain clearly why a school-wide or district-wide use would be superior to targeted services for those students. So we found those areas to be lacking as well. So that's sort of a high-level summary of what we found in our analysis. I'm happy to answer any questions on what we found or any other general questions about the LCAPs that we read before moving on.
Mr. Chavez?
Thank you. I'm really glad you went out to the field.
You're right.
Hello?
You're
Okay.
good.
I'm really glad you went out to the field and have some ground truth you're out there. My question deals on your slide 5 that talks about the goal of LCACs. Sure, all students are prepared for college or a career upon graduation. Mm-hmm. You know, 15 community colleges are going to be working towards their 4-year degree, in particular in careers. Mm-hmm. Did you see when you were out there talking about LCAC within the school district, was there any communication on developing plans between the K through 12 and the community colleges so that they can be aligned up to deal with that issue of careers?
In a couple of cases in our sample, which was relatively small compared to the number, there are 1,000 districts, we only read 50, but in a couple of cases we did see districts trying to align their career technical education course offerings with community college courses so that students could transition from the high school into the community college. That was not something that we saw in our sample across our whole sample, but we did see it in some cases, yes.
What would be your recommendation to a policymaker on how we can validate that, that coordination?
The coordination, do you mean require districts to coordinate with community colleges?
I don't know on required. Hopefully that they would see the mutual benefit because, you know, with LCAC, low control funding gives a lot of autonomy, but also responsibility to school boards to meet the needs, mm-hmm. unique needs of their children. Mm-hmm. Children, let's say in Fresno, may be different in my district where we have biocom. And I know that mm-hmm. Maricosta College in my district actually is one of the 15 community colleges that's building a facility to train people to work in biocom. So I'm asking for your advice. As a policymaker, how would I validate that this action is actually happening?
Well, one of the options the legislature has in terms of signaling to districts what it expects from them in terms of this type of course articulation is through the evaluation rubrics, where there will be statewide expectations set in terms of performance. So those performance metrics could include completion of career technical education pathways such that students can matriculate into the community colleges and continue their education there. So that's one option for ensuring that districts meet that need for students.
Thank you.
Senator Block and then Senator Pan.
Hi. You mentioned that the LCAPs you looked at for the most part didn't have baseline data, didn't break down goals into target groups so much. Who will, if in fact that's a problem, if there should be baseline data, if there should be target groups, who will be the one? Will it be the County Office of Education, the State Board of Education? Who fixes the problems that you find?
That's a great question. So our overarching recommendation from our analysis is that the LCAPs can serve as strategic plans focused on districts' areas of greatest need, and that we don't necessarily need to be concerned about having a breakout for every subgroup and metric, because in theory, the evaluation rubrics will cover that for all of the metrics that the state is interested in knowing across all subgroups. So at least the way the statute is written for the evaluation rubrics, they're meant to be holistic and cover all of the different areas. So there should be a place where that information is available to locals and to state policymakers to understand how districts are performing across all areas that the state sets as a priority.
Well, where you found, for example, there is no baseline data. It's not the business of the LAO, I would think, to go back to the districts and tell them there really should be.
Right.
Whose business is that?
The baseline data inclusion could either be a statutory change by the legislature, or the State Board of Education could amend the template that districts must use to create an LCAP, and the template could require districts to include a baseline data point.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Dennis, Dr. Pan.
Thank you. We've been taking a look in our office at some LCAPs as well. So in terms of the LCAPs that you looked at, do they, we're assigning a base plus an adjustment plus, et cetera. I mean, are they accounting for all of that money in their LCAP, or there's money that's not being accounted for in the LCAP? What portion of the funds that are being allocated are actually being accounted for in these LCAPs that you've been reviewing?
In our sample, it varied. Some districts included all of their LCFF money, their federal monies, any local foundation monies they may be receiving. Some districts only included their LCFF money in their plans, and then other districts didn't designate a funding source for the activities that they were pursuing. So it really ran the gamut of full inclusion, designating funding source, just LCFF, and then no designation. So we couldn't know if it was inclusive or not.
And the law is silent on what needs to be included in the LCAP?
The statute states that districts must include the funding associated with the action described. So it's not currently clear if they must include all funding sources.
Some clarification probably be helpful there. And then the other question, I guess, is that certainly the LCAPs, we're going to be reviewed by County Office of Education and so forth, but I also view that the voters in the school district should be able to, because after all, I mean, it's local control, right? So the school board needs to have an interaction with and I realize this is the first round, they only had a short amount of time doing it. Do you see there's improvements or revisions that could help make the LCAPs, I guess, transparent to the public as far as how their school districts are making decisions to distribute funds they're getting from the state?
Well, right now, the districts post their LCAPs on their websites.
Right.
That's not to say that the documents themselves are necessarily user-friendly.
Right.
From our perspective, we believe that if the LCAPs were narrowed to focus on districts' key areas in need of improvement, sort of the key strategies the districts are going to be tackling over the next year, that could help sort of the readability of the document and help locals understand, well, what are the main areas of focus that the district really needs to be working on?
And then finally, as we were looking at some of the LCAPs in our area, well, certainly quantitatively, they talk about this many dollars for X. So they usually don't talk about the denominator, how many students that they expect they're going to help with that amount of money or something. Is that, I don't know whether in your review, was that a gap that you saw as well, that they, you say you're going to do X, help English learners, but how many are you going to actually, with that amount of money? I mean, did you see that?
That's, your finding is consistent with what we saw. We did
Okay.
not see sort of a target population included in what districts were describing in their actions. They
Right.
rather were saying, we'll hire X number of counselors and to address
But
why
not like
need.
X number of counselors to help Y number of students.
Right, we did not
So that
see
we
that.
couldn't, so there was a way to tie, is this big enough, small enough, too big, whatever?
Right, that's
Okay, so
correct.
that's an area potentially of improvement. All right, okay, thank you.
Okay, and issues to consider moving forward?
Yes. So moving to our last page of the handout, page 8. So we've talked a little bit about the first one, which first element that we raised for you as you move on with the rest of your hearing, which is the role of the LCAP. Should it be a comprehensive document where readers can know every strategy a district is tackling in a particular year, or should it be narrowed, tailored to those that are in greatest need of improvement? Similarly, as was mentioned earlier, the county offices of education and the collaborative are going to have to support struggling districts in the future. But what's unclear is how are we going to designate which districts should fall into that category, which districts are in the yellow, in the red, when should county offices and the collaborative step in? So I think one of the questions moving forward will be, will the evaluation rubric have clear criteria for designating those districts as in need of assistance? Similarly, what level and type of support do we expect of the county offices? Do we expect them to be the first line of defense? Do we expect them to provide comprehensive assistance to districts? What do we want them to be doing in this new continuous improvement model? And then what do we expect of the collaborative? As Mr. Cabral mentioned, do we want them to be a connector, facilitate strong districts and districts who need help to work together? Do we want them to have capacity in-house to go out as sort of strike teams to districts to help them? What sort of model do we want the collaborative to have? Then how do we want this new system of continuous improvement to interact with our existing accountability systems, both at the federal and state level? We have existing systems to help struggling districts. How does this new system interweave itself with those, or what elements might we want to eliminate that we currently have or tie into this new system? Then lastly, as you touched on in the first panel also, what resources are required for this new system? What do county offices need to be that first line of defense or to be a comprehensive line of defense? What does the collaborative require in order to fulfill whatever role the legislature wishes it to fulfill? So that's the end of my presentation, but I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Okay, any other questions?
County offices of education, now that we have LCAP, is there anything that they were doing prior to LCAP that they're no longer required to do?
Yes, they received a number of categorical programs that the requirements for which were eliminated under LCFF. County offices must still serve alternative education students, so they still have to have that role and responsibility. But the roles and requirements for their support to their districts is much less defined under LCFF. The requirements that in terms of things they must do is much less defined.
That's what I thought. So then is there have you seen in your trips any restructuring of the County Office of Education to find savings or shifting of resources so it's no longer a requirement for your last
So
bullet?
we've not done a comprehensive assessment of how county offices have shifted their workload in response, though we have seen some county offices who have taken a very proactive approach to their new role under the LCFF system, tailoring themselves to try to be able to provide support to districts, using their academic folks to educate districts about how to fill out an LCAP, reviewing draft LCAPs for them, reviewing them, providing guidance and feedback, but that has not been happening universally across county offices.
Well, maybe later on we'll have a best practices from the COEs so that there will be no requirement for resources, just a restructuring of a new workload.
Right.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Thank you very much. Let's bring up our panel, perspectives on opportunities, challenges, and options. We have a Superintendent Ellen Doherty from Lawndale Elementary School District, Dr. Gary Waddell, a Deputy Superintendent, San Mateo County Office of Education, Dr. Linda Darling Hammond, Professor, Stanford Graduate School of Education, and Liz Gilliam, Director of Legislative and Community Affairs for Public Advocates. Welcome to the table here. Okay, specifically, you were asked to look at a couple of questions. What have been the successes and challenges in developing and implementing local control and accountability plans, the LCAPs? What is necessary to support local education agencies and build their capacity to implement LCFF planning and accountability provisions to achieve their LCAP goals? And specifically, what will the county offices of education and the collaborative and the State Board of Education and CDE need to do to support local education agencies to provide oversight for this system? And as the state's accountability system evolves in the light of LCFF legislation, what will be the roles of the new evaluation rubrics, the Academic Performance Index, the School Accountability Report Card? And from a state and local perspective, what are the key elements of an effective accountability system? So with that, welcome. Thank you. So let's start with Dr. Ellen Doherty. Thank you. I think you need a microphone and make sure the light is on.
It's on. Hello, I'm Ellen Doherty, and I'm the superintendent in Lawndale Elementary School District in LA County. We have about 89% of our students are on free and reduced lunch. About 52% are English learners. I'm also the co-chair of the Superintendent's Council for the Association of California School Administrators, and ACSA represents approximately 16,000 school leaders across the state. For me, this has been one of the most exciting times since I've been an educator. We've been having conversations for over a year now about the needs of our students and having the funds to think about what we specifically need in Lawndale for our students. I'd like to thank Senator Liu and the Senate committee for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to discuss the implementation of the local control funding formula and the accountability plans, because I feel it is very important. The LCFF and the LCAP have provided varying degrees of success, such as a greater use of resources and allowing decision-making that are locally driven. However, with these successes, there are just as many challenges that we face to provide the type of education that our 6 million children deserve. Some of our greatest successes are also our greatest challenges. The increased engagement of our parents, students, teachers, and community provided invaluable dialogue about school district plans. Many leaders received great responses from their community and through community meetings and surveys. Both parents and students were excited to have the opportunity to contribute and offer suggestions regarding district plans to educate the students. In my district, we held 29 stakeholder meetings in both English and Spanish for teachers, parents, students, and community members. These discussions resulted in a document that was realistic, provided improved services for all of our students, and aligned all district goals. But also, we now have academic goals. We have goals in student wellness, parent engagement, school culture, and they're very robust goals. And with the metrics that the state gave us and the ones that we are using for ourselves, we have a challenge ahead of us. In most cases, the district developed a 3-year plan, which we did too, that is consistent with budgetary planning and including monitoring, data collection, and evaluation. However, the process to engage the community was also some people's biggest challenge. For some districts, they found it challenging to recruit parents to be involved to obtain student input. For example, one of my colleagues conducted almost 30 presentations throughout the community with great involvement. This year, 3 parents participated. There were also significant changes the first year in the lack of information and conflicting information from a variety of resources regarding the LCAP. And in addition, as stated already today, the timeline for the development was too compressed and hampered to have the opportunity for meaningful dialogue. But in our district, we went to 24 students in a classroom, K-3. We have all-day kindergarten for many of our students who don't have a preschool education. We've been able to hire social workers with a counseling degree so that now we also are working with USC, and we have 27 social worker interns in our schools. We've also hired parent liaisons to work with our teachers and our parents for get more parents engaged in our classrooms. In order for us to complete the plan, our LCAP is nearly 50 pages long. And so we've published it in both English and Spanish, but it is very cumbersome and difficult for parents to understand. And one of the problems is that some of the most important parts of our plan are the small details of what we're actually doing for our students. But the details of the plans are the important part, and those all have to do with what is best for our students. So there are a few key items that would help districts in this transition. First, building the capacity of the county offices of education. The counties need the tools to be consistent in their effort to support school districts and to provide insight. And we need to be consistent within the counties and across the counties. It's important to remember that one size does not fit all, so they need to allow the local decisions and time to evaluate effectiveness. And in some counties, there's been too much focus on compliance with the template and not really the importance of what's happening with the students. And most importantly, we need to continue to be flexible in the review of the LCAPs during these inaugural years. This is all new for all of us, and it's a process that needs to take time and take time to be refined. Of course, we need to finish the rubric but maintain our local control. There needs to be a rubric because without a specific rubric, it is unclear what is expected of us, and it is unclear how the plans will be evaluated and approved. And local control should stay as local control because the community right next to me with the same demographics actually has a plan that is rich and robust for their students, and it is different than ours. Accountability, a delay in the API would give time for districts to implement the LCAP plans. Once we have all of the metrics in place for the API, then we can incorporate all of those plans into our plans. It would be most helpful that the LEA plan, the single plans for student achievement, the district goals, and the LCAP plan, the API, all had the same metrics and were all connected so that we had one document. We have created that in Lawndale for ourselves, but it would be it would make things mean a whole lot more for us in our community if all of that was in one document. And we need more resources. Well, education is certainly seeing increased resources this year. LCFF was a redistribution model and not a funding model that is aligned with student needs or state expectations. Our state is still at the bottom of the nation in staffing our schools with the quantity and quality of positions. These include instructional aides, librarians, school nurses, assistant principals, yard duties, counselors, and many others who provide the necessary support to ensure that our students are successful. In summary, the implementation of the LCFF and the LCAP have been a wonderful reform, but is not without its challenges and the needs for some time and continuous improvement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. County Office of Education, welcome.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairman and members. I'm Gary Waddell, Deputy Superintendent of Instructional Services at the San Mateo County Office of Education, and immediate past chair of the Curriculum Instruction Steering Committee of CSESA, the California County Superintendent's Educational Services Association. Thank you for the opportunity to be here this afternoon. As you know very well, we're in the middle of a unique moment where we're implementing our first LCAPs and developing our second ones. We're very hopeful about the impact that these will have and really to help us reimagine what we will do differently to change the conditions of learning and the outcomes for students. I'd like to briefly share my observations of the LCAP process, a few reflections on the roles of county offices, and to briefly look to the future in terms of the role of the rubrics and accountability and assessments. We are at a unique moment in our state, as you very well know. We have new standards, new frameworks, new assessments, all of this at the same time that we're implementing LCFF and LCAPs. This moment, this opportunity is really leveraged by the fact that many of our students have not yet received what they need to achieve their full potential. These students disproportionately, students of color, English learners, students of living in poverty, and foster youth. So the time is really ripe for us to engage in thoughtful collaborative planning. This notion of planning for schools and districts certainly isn't a new one. We've been about that business for a long time. But too often the planning of our past was siloed and disconnected, built as it was on a complex categorical system of funding that resulted often in disjointed systems of support. The LCAP signifies a departure from that to build bold, ambitious plans that are informed by data and, importantly, by local stakeholder input. This notion of authentic stakeholder input has really been a game changer, in my view. Too often the planning of our past the input of our past came after the planning work was done and served to bless or confirm what we had done rather than to truly inform that process. The LCAP imagines all of that differently, and it's a critical distinction. Certainly there were challenges in year one. It was a new process. In many ways, we were building the car while we were driving it. Addressing all of the 8 state priorities and all of the associated metrics, and resisting the urge to return to a compliance mindset that was about checking boxes rather than really engage thoughtful planning was a challenge. Our task was really to endeavor to hold this North Star of thoughtful, data-informed, collaborative planning firmly in sight and not revert back to that former mentality that sometimes we had. That really was about checklists rather than complexity. Certainly the LAO's recent recommendation to emphasize clear strategic plans over detailed comprehensive plans is a compelling one. The role of county offices is critical, has been critical, and will continue to be, both in the review processes and, more importantly, in the heavy lift of training and support. To this end, the State Superintendents Association developed extensive training materials and review manuals together last year with the interest of bringing consistency in those review processes. These were heavily used across the state, and this is work that continues to be refined into the current year. County offices are really in a unique role to help districts balance the requirements of the regulations and the needs of local planning, local input and stakeholder input. Counties are very appreciative of the $20 million in one-time funding that is in the governor's budget. However, as this is ongoing work, we're eager to continue to work with the governor and legislature to provide ongoing resources to support these quality systems of technical assistance and review. This was really new work, and it was really mammoth work, and the support function is the one that we don't talk about as much. That was very intensive and had the most promise in our practices this year. So what's on the horizon? Did we get this right? I think the rubrics will help us answer that question. They need to play both of their two roles well. Their summative function of assessing performance and identifying needed technical assistance and intervention, and the critical formative function of serving as a tool for districts' self-reflection and growth, and that's a key piece. It is essential that they fulfill the promise of being holistic and multidimensional. It's a high bar, but necessary. If we get this wrong, if we oversimplify and boil complex processes down to a few quantitative measures, our history tells us that our system will respond by focusing only on what it takes to move the needle on those measures, and we will have lost much of the promise of the system. All of this, of course, must be nested in an accountability system that honors these core assumptions: focus on growth, complex ways of knowing our students and what they know and are able to do. These components, an LCAP that sets the stage for ambitious actions and services for all students and are explicit in how we provide services to our students with the greatest needs, rubrics that guide and inform and inspire as well as evaluate, an accountability system that acknowledges complex ways of knowing and is grounded in growth, are the promise of this work and its potential to positively impact the lives of California students. Thank you.
Thank you very much.